The chapel fell silent the moment I stepped through the heavy wooden doors. Not a polite hush, but something deeper. A silence that belonged to this moment, pregnant with meaning and weight. I was General Charlotte Ashford, standing in my Royal Marines dress uniform rather than a white wedding gown, and this silence held an entire lifetime of vindication in it. Just moments before, backstage in the preparation room, a message had arrived on my phone. My sister Isabel. Even now, even on this day, she couldn't resist. The text glowed on the screen, words designed to sting. Wearing the uniform again. What are you trying to prove, Charlotte? That you're not woman enough for a real dress? That you need to play soldier to matter? I had stood there, my hand trembling slightly as I read the second message that followed instantly. You've spent your whole life trying to be a man, but you'll never have their respect. You're just a joke in that costume. The words were meant to cut, they always were, but something had changed in me over the years. The pain still came, but it no longer had power. Instead, I felt something else entirely, clarity, and beneath it, a quiet, unshakable certainty about who I was and what I had built. My name is General Charlotte Ashford, and this is the story of how I learned that the family you build yourself is infinitely more powerful than the family you're born into. The first memory I have of my sister Isabel is her smile. That perfect practice smile that could light up a room and make adults believe anything she wanted them to believe. I was 8 years old, standing in the gymnasium of my primary school in North Yorkshire, nervously adjusting the model solar system I'd spent 3 weeks constructing out of styrofoam and papier-mâché. It wasn't perfect. Jupiter tilted slightly to one side. Saturn's rings were uneven. But it was mine, made with my own hands, born from my own curiosity about the vastness of space. My teacher, Mrs. Williams, was examining my work, nodding with genuine approval. "This is exceptional, Charlotte," she said, her voice warm. "You've really understood the mechanics here. The attention to detail is remarkable." My chest puffed out with pride. This was what excellence felt like. Isabel appeared beside us, just 11 years old, already perfecting the art of appearing innocent. She was holding a cup of orange fizzy drink, and her smile, that devastating smile, was radiant. The moment Mrs. Williams turned to speak with another student, Isabel's foot came out. It was perfectly timed, perfectly executed. Not an obvious trip, but a clumsy stumble that sent her sprawling forward. The orange drink arced through the air in slow motion, and I watched, horrified, as it splashed across my entire project. The planets dissolved into a sticky orange pulp. "Oh, Charlotte, I'm so sorry!" Isabel cried, her eyes immediately filling with tears. Real tears, or so perfectly performed that the distinction didn't matter. "I'm such a klutz. I'm so sorry." Our parents rushed over. My mother put her arm around Isabel, stroking her hair. "It's okay, sweetie. It was just an accident. Don't cry." My father looked at me, not at the wreckage of my work, but directly at me, as if my tears were the real problem. "Don't make your sister feel worse, Charlotte," he said firmly. "It was an accident. These things happen." I stood there, looking at the destroyed model, and in that moment, I understood something that would shape the rest of my life. A smile could be a weapon, an apology could be a calculated strike, and love, the kind I was supposed to feel for my sister, could be used against me. As we grew older, Isabel's methods became more refined, her cruelty more surgical. At 17, during a family Sunday roast, my father asked about my A-level results. I'd just received them. They were nearly perfect, the kind of scores that would open doors to any university in the country. Before I could respond, Isabel cut in smoothly, her voice dripping with false pride. "Charlotte is doing wonderfully academically," she said, turning to our parents with that practiced smile. "She joined the school's rugby team, you know. She can tackle boys twice her size. Quite the athlete." The table went quiet. A few of my uncles exchanged uncomfortable glances. In one perfectly constructed sentence, Isabel had twisted my academic achievement into something strange, something that marked me as other. She'd made my strength into a liability, my discipline into oddness. My father, mortified, immediately pivoted. He launched into a glowing monologue about Isabel's debate team victories, her recent win at a regional tournament. I sat there with a piece of roast stuck in my throat, feeling utterly invisible at my own family's table. But the masterpiece of her campaign came on the night of the school formal. It was a tradition I had no interest in. Isabel was going as the formal queen, stunning in an elaborate gown our mother had driven all the way to Manchester to purchase. I'd planned to spend the evening doing what I actually enjoyed, reading about military history, studying maps, understanding the mechanics of strategy. But Isabel, ever the benevolent sister, couldn't allow me that peace. In front of our parents, she positioned herself perfectly. "You know," she said, turning to me with concern painted across her face. "Maybe you should come to the formal anyway, Charlotte. You could help supervise with the teachers. You're so good at giving orders. Someone should benefit from that." The words wrapped in that sweet smile were a public execution. They declared that I didn't belong with the other teenagers, that my natural place was on the sidelines, a rigid, joyless authority figure. Our mother immediately agreed. "What a wonderful idea. You should go, Charlotte. It'll be fun for you." That night, I locked my bedroom door and turned up my stereo as loud as it would go, drowning out the sounds of their laughter and the distant thumping bass from the school hall. I made a decision in that moment. I would escape. This house wasn't a home. It was a cage designed to shrink me into something smaller, something more manageable, something less threatening to my sister's carefully constructed identity. My escape plan was an application for a Marine option scholarship. It was the only path I could see that led away from this place, away from the psychological warfare that had become the language of my family. I prepared everything in secret, knowing that if Isabel found out, she would find a way to sabotage it. The application required a letter of recommendation from a retired Royal Marines colonel who lived in our town. His glowing letter arrived in the post, and I was euphoric, finally seeing my path forward. Then it disappeared. A frantic search of Isabel's room, buried at the bottom of her laundry hamper, revealed it. The letter was crumpled, stained with what looked like nail polish, deliberately damaged. When I confronted her, she didn't even look up from the crimson she was painting on her nails. "I was just trying to help you," she said, her voice calm and infuriating. "You're more fragile than you think. They would chew you up in the Marines. You'll thank me for this one day." That breathtaking arrogance, that assumption that she had the right to dictate my future, didn't break me. It ignited something instead. Years of quiet humiliation, swallowed anger, and silent tears finally crystallized into a single burning point of pure resolve. I smoothed out the wrinkled letter. I submitted my application again, and I swore to myself with every fiber of my being that this time I would not fail. I looked out my bedroom window, not at the familiar Yorkshire street, but at a distant horizon. If I couldn't earn respect in this house, maybe, just maybe, I could command it somewhere else. The words Isabel had thrown at me like stones. "They will chew you up," became fuel. They became the fire that would propel me forward. The commissioning ceremony as a second lieutenant in the Royal Marines was brief and formal, a clean severance from the life I'd left behind. But the reality of my new world at the Commando Training Centre in Lympstone, Devon, was far more brutal than I'd anticipated. The thick, humid coastal air clung to everything. The smell of salt marsh, pine needles, and the particular mustiness of barracks that had housed military personnel for decades. The mornings began before dawn with the guttural shouts of drill instructors, and every single day was lived under the weight of scrutinizing, dismissive eyes. As one of only a handful of female officers at the base, I wasn't just a rarity. I was an anomaly, a question mark in a rigid masculine world that had no framework for understanding me. In the mess hall, surrounded by the clatter of trays and loud conversation, I'd catch whispers floating over from other tables. "Diversity quota hire. Wonder how long she'll last. Probably got the commission to fill some requirement." During operational briefings, my tactical suggestions were met with polite, vacant silence, as if I'd been speaking another language entirely. My very presence was a disruption to their established order. They gave me a nickname, one I never heard to my face but felt in their sideways glances and the sudden silence when I entered a room: the Ice Princess. It was because I didn't participate in their crude banter, because I maintained professional distance instead of forced camaraderie, because I was efficient and measured and utterly indifferent to being liked. But I wasn't there to make friends. I was there to command their respect, and I knew I couldn't win it by trying to be like them. I couldn't outbench press them or beat them in a brawl. So I resolved to outthink, outwork, and outlast every single one of them. My battle wasn't physical. It was intellectual, methodical, relentless. I was the first officer to arrive at the battalion offices each morning. The smell of stale coffee my only welcome. the last to leave long after the Devon moon had risen. While the other lieutenants were blowing off steam at the pubs in Portsmouth, I was in the combat simulation center, running tactical scenarios over and over until the digital battlefield felt more real than my Spartan barracks room. My tactical reports were flawless, my logistical plans airtight, every detail cross-referenced and verified. I learned to field strip my SA-80 rifle in complete darkness, my fingers moving with mechanical certainty until the weapon felt like an extension of my own arm. I didn't waste energy on words. I didn't argue or explain. I let the results of my work speak for me. The true test came during a grueling 3-day land navigation course set deep within the challenging terrain of the Devon countryside. It was designed to break you down and see if you had the mental fortitude to find your way back. My nemesis was a fellow lieutenant named Richardson, a swaggering officer who seemed to take my existence as a personal insult. On the first morning, as we were issued our gear, Richardson grinned slyly and handed me a faulty map and a tampered compass, its needle subtly but critically misaligned. His plan was transparent. He wanted me lost, alone, forced to radio for a humiliating rescue. I didn't realize I'd been sabotaged until dusk on the first day. The setting sun cast long shadows through the dense woodland, and the coordinates on my map refused to align with the terrain. A cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach as the sky bruised from orange to purple and rain began to fall. But the fear was consumed almost immediately by white-hot anger. I was alone in the dark with no proper map and no functional compass. But I wasn't helpless. Isabel had tried to sabotage my future. Richardson was trying to sabotage my career. The pattern was identical. The rage gave me clarity. I had the stars, which were beginning to pierce the cloud cover. I had the prevailing wind. And I had a memory for detail that bordered on photographic. During my lonely nights, I'd read not just military history but books on astronomy. I found the North Star. I oriented myself. And I began to walk, pushing through tangled undergrowth, wading through knee-deep murky water, thorns tearing at my fatigues and my skin. On the morning of the third day, as Richardson and his cronies were solemnly reporting me officially lost to the supervising officer, I emerged from the tree line. My uniform was shredded, my face was smeared with mud and scratched, but my back was ramrod straight. I walked directly to the instructor's table, ignoring the stunned silence that fell over the room. I slapped down my grid sheet, every waypoint marked with perfect precision. The silence was broken by the scraping of a chair. Cutler Sergeant McAllister, a grizzled old-school Marine, a man who had never served under a woman and who had only ever called me lass, pushed himself to his feet. He looked me up and down, taking in my disheveled state. Then his gaze shifted to Richardson, and his eyes narrowed with contempt. He turned back to me without a word, picked up a steaming metal mug of tea from his own desk, and held it out to me. My filthy, trembling fingers wrapped around its warmth. "Good work, Lieutenant," he said gruffly. He used my rank, not lass, not young woman. My rank, it was just 2 words spoken in a gravelly voice, but for me it was the first medal I'd ever truly earned. The respect I earned in the Devon countryside was just a beginning. The real test came on the battlefield. By the time I was promoted to captain, I'd been assigned to a forward operating base in Kandahar province, Afghanistan. My job was planning and logistics, staring at maps in an air-conditioned container while others went outside the wire. It was safe. It was my duty. And I hated it. The air there was a permanent cocktail of diesel fumes, gunpowder, and fine desert sand that got into everything. Your food, your lungs, your soul. The operation center hummed with quiet activity, screens glowing in the darkness, the constant flow of information. Then the call came over the radio network like a lightning strike. Static, then panicked voices cutting through the mundane hum. A Chinook helicopter carrying a force recon team had been shot down on the outskirts of Kandahar city. The survivors were pinned down, surrounded, taking heavy fire. A quick reaction force was being scrambled immediately. I could have stayed. I should have stayed. My job was coordinating support from the ops center. But I looked at the digital map on the screen, at the flashing red icon indicating the crash site. I saw the roster of Marines on that Chinook. I knew their names. I had planned their mission. I had sent them there. A cold, heavy sense of responsibility washed over me. Not guilt, ownership. I grabbed my rifle, slapped on my helmet, and ran out into the blinding Afghan sun. I jumped onto the last Land Rover in the rescue convoy, ignoring the shocked look on the platoon commander's face. There was no time to argue. We plunged into the city. Kandahar wasn't a city. It was a maze of death, narrow, dusty alleyways that turned into kill zones without warning. The air filled with the constant high-pitched buzz of bullets like a swarm of angry hornets. The crack of sniper fire echoed off the concrete buildings, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Then the lead Land Rover was hit by an RPG. The world erupted in a deafening roar of fire and shrapnel. The convoy ground to a halt. A sitting duck in the middle of the street. Panic began to ripple through our radio net. I could hear it in the clipped, frantic voices. I could hear the desperate calls from the pinned-down recon team. Then I heard the voice of Sergeant Cooper, normally the calmest, most unflappable Marine I knew. It was trembling. We're taking fire from all sides. We can't hold this position. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I was no longer a staff officer. I was no longer the Ice Princess. I was a Marine. I keyed the command channel and my voice boomed through the radio. A cold, clear growl that cut through the chaos. All call signs, this is Valkyrie. Establish a 360-degree perimeter now. Gun trucks, suppressive fire on those second-story windows. Cooper, give me a sit-rep on your casualties. My voice didn't betray a hint of the fear coiling in my gut. That calculated calm, that assertion of control, pulled them back from the brink of chaos. It gave them direction. Through the dust and smoke, I saw him. Sergeant Major Harrison, his leg bleeding badly, was trying to drag an unconscious Marine from the burning wreck of the lead Land Rover. Enemy fire was converging on their position, kicking up plumes of dirt all around them. He was going to die there. There was no thought process, no weighing of options. A line from a Sunday school's lesson my mother used to read flashed through my mind. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. I was out of the vehicle and sprinting before I even registered the decision. The ground around me erupted as bullets stitched a path toward me. A piece of shrapnel, hot and angry, slammed into my shoulder. The force nearly knocked me off my feet, and a searing pain shot down my arm. But I saw the look in Harrison's eyes, the desperation of a good man trying to do the impossible. I gritted my teeth against the pain, reached them, and together we hauled the unconscious Marine behind the cover of a low wall, just seconds before the Land Rover's fuel tank exploded in a massive fireball. As I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, I felt a pair of eyes on me. From a rooftop across the street providing cover fire, Sergeant Cooper had seen the whole thing. I woke up stateside in the sterile white world of Queen Elizabeth Military Hospital in Birmingham. The pain in my shoulder was a dull, constant throb, a reminder of the fight. But it was nothing compared to the quiet in the ward. The other wounded Marines in the room, men with injuries far worse than mine, no longer looked through me. The whispers were gone. The dismissive glances had been replaced by something else, a quiet, solemn respect. A few days later, Sergeant Cooper, a fresh scar tracing a line across his cheek, walked into my room. He didn't say much. He just placed a cold can of Coke on my bedside table, the red and white stark against the drab hospital sheets. "Thanks, ma'am," he said. The word sounding different than it ever had before. Not a formal address. An acknowledgement later, I started hearing it, a new name spoken in hushed but appreciative tones by the nurses, by other Marines who came to visit. Not Ice Princess, they called me Ironclad. Ironclad. A name born of fire and smoke and a split-second decision in a dusty street in Kandahar. That name became my true identity. It was more precious than any medal, more valuable than any star on my shoulder. The weeks I spent at Queen Elizabeth Military Hospital were a strange paradox of pain and peace. My shoulder ached with a deep grinding throb, a constant reminder of the shrapnel still embedded near the bone. But for the first time in months, I slept in a real bed under clean sheets without the fear of a mortar attack waking me. The quiet halls of the hospital became a sanctuary. The other Marines in the ward, carrying scars far more grievous than my own, no longer looked through me. We became a brotherhood of the broken, sharing silent nods over morning tea, trading stories of physical therapy nightmares, finding comfort in quiet company. Sergeant Major Harrison and Sergeant Cooper visited almost every day, smuggling in real coffee to replace the hospital's bland brew, bringing news from our unit. In that sterile space, surrounded by my chosen family, I felt a sense of belonging I had never known in my own home. I was naive. I let myself believe that perhaps the hardest war, the one against my own family, had been left behind in the dusty streets of Kandahar. That fragile peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. A nurse switched on the television in the common room, and there she was, my sister Isabel, on screen, interviewed in prime time. She sat poised and elegant in a designer dress, her face a mask of thoughtful concern as she spoke to a famous host about the burdens of war and the hidden strength of women in conflict. Then a massive full-screen graphic appeared behind her. It was a photo of me taken in the immediate aftermath of the firefight. But the image had been artfully cropped. My captain's bars were gone. The wreckage and chaos of the background were blurred into obscurity. All that remained was my face streaked with grime, hair matted with sweat and blood, and the raw, determined look in my eyes. Isabel gestured to the image of my ravaged face. "My sister," she said, her voice filled with beautifully modulated solemnity. "She is an inspiration to us all." The common room fell silent. Every Marine, every nurse, every visitor turned from the television to look at me, sitting in my wheelchair. The feeling that washed over me wasn't pride. It was a sickening, profound sense of violation. I felt naked, exposed. My moment of sacrifice and survival stripped of its context and hung up for display like a hunting trophy. I'd been turned into a prop for her performance. A few days later, she called. Her voice on the phone was as sweet as honeyed poison. "Charlotte, darling, did you see the show? The entire country is talking about you. I've already spoken to a producer. We're going to do a documentary series about you. About women who break barriers. I'll be the executive producer. This is your chance, Charlotte. You're going to be an icon." I listened to her saccharine pitch, and a single cold question echoed in my mind. An icon for whom? She never once asked how my shoulder was. She never asked if the nightmares had started. She just saw a story she could sell, a brand she could build on the foundation of my scars. Then my parents called, their voices filled with genuine pride for the first time in my life. "Isabel is doing such a wonderful thing for you, darling," my mother gushed. "She's really helping your career." The anger inside me didn't explode. It didn't burn hot. It crystallized into a solid, heavy block of ice in my chest, cold, clear, and sharp-edged. I turned my head and looked out the large window of my hospital room. Down below on the manicured lawn, I saw a young Marine, his legs gone, struggling to master his new prosthetic limbs. Another being pushed in a wheelchair, his eyes vacant and staring. That was my legacy. They were my legacy. Not some glossy, sanitized television show produced by my sister. I picked up the phone and called her back. "Isabel," I said, my voice low and devoid of all emotion. "Listen to me very carefully. My story, my scars, and the lives of the men I serve with are not commodities for you to market. Do not ever use my image again." I hung up before she could utter a single word of protest. Then, with methodical precision, I opened my contacts list and blocked her number. Then my father's, then my mother's. The silence that followed in the room was absolute. In that profound quiet, surrounded by the quiet dignity of real sacrifice, I made a decision. My legacy would not be written by her. I would build my own. When I walked out of the sterile white halls of Queen Elizabeth Military Hospital, I didn't return to celebrate my service as a war hero. I returned with a new mission, one forged in the fire of my family's betrayal. The words of my fiancé, James, had become my compass. "Don't just react to her, Charlotte," he'd said. "Build something she can never touch." So I did. Instead of accepting a prestigious staff position at the Ministry of Defence, I made a request that baffled my superiors. I asked for a transfer to the Veteran Support Division, a quiet, overlooked corner of the military's bureaucracy. My colleagues thought I was insane. It was seen as a career dead end, but it was there, in a cramped office amidst grey filing cabinets and stacks of dusty paperwork, that I laid the first brick of what I privately called Project Aegis, a name taken from the mythical shield of the gods, a symbol of divine protection for those left vulnerable. It wasn't glamorous. It began not with a press conference, but with small, relentless actions. I made phone calls, set up coffee meetings in cheap diners with recently discharged Marines. Most importantly, I listened. I learned that the war doesn't truly end when a soldier steps off the plane. For so many, a new, quieter, and far more insidious war was just beginning inside their own minds. Using my own savings, I hired dedicated civilian therapists who understood the culture. Together, we set up a discreet 24/7 hotline, a completely confidential lifeline that operated outside the military's slow, impersonal official channels. It was a small shield, but it was a start. It was through this network that I met Lance Corporal Mitchell, We met in a dingy diner on the outskirts of London, the kind of place with cracked red vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner for hours. In Afghanistan, Mitchell had been an elite sniper, a man whose hands were so unnaturally steady he could thread a needle from 1,000 yards. Now, as he sat across from me, his hands trembled so violently he could barely lift his cup without spilling the dark liquid onto the table. He told me about the nights, the endless, suffocating, sleepless nights where he would lie in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the faces of men he'd killed replaying in his mind like a horrific looping film reel, the sudden, crippling panic attacks that would seize him in the supermarket, the overwhelming certainty that an IED was hidden in the cereal aisle. The official military system had processed him. They'd given him sleeping pills and a glossy, useless pamphlet on readjusting to civilian life. They had treated the deep, gaping wounds in his soul as if they were a minor administrative inconvenience. I spoke with him for hours, not as a general to a lance corporal, but as one survivor to another. I didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. I simply listened. I saw the profound emptiness in his eyes, an abyss of pain that felt terrifyingly familiar. In that moment, Project Aegis ceased to be a professional endeavor. It became a personal crusade. The fight was lonely and deeply frustrating. While I was struggling to find funding, struggling to convince skeptical colonels that mental health was as critical as body armor, I stumbled across a video on YouTube. It was Isabel. She was the keynote speaker at a major tech conference in London, polished and immaculate in an elegant white pantsuit. She stood on a brightly lit stage speaking to a captivated audience about the importance of authentic listening and digital age healing. She spoke of empathy and connection, her words flowing with practiced sincerity. A wave of physical nausea washed over me. I knew it was all a performance, a carefully crafted illusion. She, who had never truly listened to another person in her life, was being celebrated as a guru of connection. The jarring contrast between her slick, empty rhetoric in a London auditorium and my quiet, desperate battle in a greasy spoon diner was obscene. She was selling platitudes. I was trying to save a life. The tragedy I had been fighting so hard to prevent came on a cold Tuesday morning. The call came not from a duty officer, but from Mitchell's mother, her voice shattered by grief. He was gone. He had taken his own life. A few days later, she sent me the letter he'd left behind. It was filled with apologies, with words of pain and despair. And then at the very end, a single line addressed to me. General Floyd was the only one who ever made me feel like I was seen, even just for a moment. The words on the page blurred through my tears. The sentence ripped through my heart. A clean, devastating wound. The profound grief I felt for this young man, for the life he would never live, quickly hardened into cold, diamond-hard rage. My fight was no longer for a project. It was for Lance Corporal Mitchell. It was for his legacy and for the thousands of other soldiers just like him, lost in the shadows, forgotten by the very system they had sworn to serve. I would not let them be forgotten. My quiet crusade was over. I would make the Ministry of Defense listen. The real war had just begun. The war for Mitchell's legacy, the war to get Project Aegis formally recognized and funded, was entirely different from any battle I'd fought before. My enemies weren't insurgents with AK-47s in dusty alleyways. They were well-fed generals with stars on their shoulders, powerful politicians on parliamentary committees, and the vast, soul-crushing bureaucracy of the Defense Ministry itself. I presented my meticulously crafted proposals in cold, sterile conference rooms, facing a wall of skeptical, dismissive faces. They would listen politely, their fingers steepled, and then dismantle my life's purpose with bureaucratic jargon. It's too expensive, General. It's not in the current budget cycle. This falls outside our strategic priorities. The most painful refrain was the one unspoken but clearly implied. They saw mental health struggles not as a sacred responsibility, but as a personal failing, a sign of weakness. Every day I walked the endless echoing corridors of the Ministry of Defense, the polished linoleum floors stretching out like a sterile desert. I felt more alone, more exhausted in that climate-controlled maze of power than I ever had on a desolate battlefield under a scorching sun. It was in one of those soul-crushing meetings that I met James Thornton. He was a civilian strategic analyst for the Defense Ministry, a brilliant mind hidden behind a quiet demeanor and thick-rimmed glasses. Unlike the uniformed officers in the room, he wasn't dazzled or intimidated by the stars on my shoulders. He just listened. After the briefing, he approached me. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He asked sharp, incisive questions about logistics, about data architecture for the hotline, about metrics for measuring efficacy. For the first time, someone looked at Project Aegis, not as a charitable pet project, but as what it was, a full-scale military campaign against a deeply entrenched enemy. We started having lunch together in the Defense Ministry's crowded cafeteria. Our conversations, a strange mix of military acronyms and analytical frameworks. But beneath the technical jargon, a deeper connection was forming. A mutual respect between two minds that saw the world in similar structured ways. James became my sanctuary, my secure rear echelon in a protracted war. He was the one I could vent to after another soul-destroying meeting. The one who would listen without judgment. He didn't just offer comfort. He offered strategy. He would take my arguments, help me refine them, find the logical fallacies in my opponent's reasoning, and hand my ideas back to me sharper and stronger than before. One evening, I was slumped on the sofa in my Richmond flat, utterly defeated after a particularly brutal day. He didn't say a word. He just sat down beside me, handed me a mug of hot tea, and said quietly, "Attrition warfare is a valid strategy, General. Just keep showing up. They'll break before you do." Our love didn't blossom from flowers or fancy dinners. It was built in the trenches of shared battles, forged in the fires of intellectual respect. He proposed to me one Tuesday night in the most wonderfully unceremonious way imaginable. We were in our kitchen making pasta together, the air filled with the smell of garlic and basil. He paused, a wooden spoon in his hand, and looked at me with that calm, steady gaze I'd come to rely on. "Should we make this official?" he asked, as if suggesting we buy a new piece of furniture. It was the most romantic thing I had ever heard. "Yes," I said, without a single moment of hesitation. When the news of our engagement was announced, Isabel launched her next most public attack. She posted on her public Twitter feed. The picture was a slick, provocative image, a pair of muddy, worn-out combat boots placed right next to a pristine, elegant slice of wedding cake. Her caption dripped with venom disguised as wit. "Congrats to my commanding little sister on her engagement." She finished the post with a cruel, searchable label meant to define me and invite ridicule. "Commanding bride." The phrase went viral. It was picked up by gossip blogs and commentators, spawning a wave of mockery about the dictator bride, the soldier's bride. Memes appeared. My private joy was twisted into a public spectacle, a caricature of an aggressive, unfeminine woman who couldn't separate her job from her life. I stared at my phone, a cold, sickening rage making my hands tremble. She had taken my happiness, the one pure and simple thing I had built for myself, and turned it into a weapon against me for public amusement. But as I sat there reeling from the blow, I remembered James's words. I remembered the faces of the men in my unit, and I realized something profound. This time, I wasn't alone. Isabel's tweet ignited a firestorm, just as she'd intended. But the fire didn't burn me. It forged an army at my back. A counter-offensive launched not from a command center, but from the living rooms and hearts of the British military community. Military spouses, grizzled veterans, and active duty personnel I had never met took her label and claimed it as their own. They turned her insult into a rallying cry. The hashtag commanding bride started trending, followed by dress blues wedding and ironclad's honor. Photos flooded social media. Women in uniform on their wedding days, their faces beaming with pride. Men standing proudly by their servicewomen partners, their salutes sharp and respectful. My official Defense Ministry email was inundated with hundreds of messages, not just from Marines I knew, but from soldiers, sailors, and airmen from every corner of the country, all with the same unwavering message: "We stand with you." They offered to fly in on their own dime to stand guard at my wedding. The uniform, the very symbol Isabel had tried to weaponize as a mark of shame, had become my flag. A banner under which all the respect I had bled for was now gathering into an undeniable force. My only public response to the storm was a single defiant act of quiet dignity. I posted a clean, simple photo of my dress blues uniform hung and ready on my private Instagram account. The caption was 7 carefully chosen words. "This is what honor looks like." The day of my wedding arrived, a crisp, brilliant autumn day in Surrey. The historic chapel at Sandhurst was packed to the rafters, not with my father's business partners or Isabel's media friends, but with a tidal wave of uniformed service members. It wasn't 50. It was 500 men and women in their immaculate dress uniforms, a breathtaking sea of midnight blue and scarlet and gold. They filled every pew, stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisles, and spilled out into the courtyard, their presence a silent, powerful testament. They had come on their own, no invitations required. From my hiding place in the preparation room, I peeked through a crack in the door. I saw my parents and Isabel in the front pew, the space reserved for family. They looked small, fragile, and utterly out of place. 3 drab sparrows lost in a magnificent forest of eagles. They were islands of civilian clothing in a vast ocean of military honor. I could see the visible shock on Isabel's face, her perfect composure finally cracking. Her skin, usually glowing, was pale. Her eyes were wide with disbelief that bordered on panic. She had intended for me to be the spectacle, the joke. Instead, she had become a front-row spectator to a stunning display of my power. A power she could never understand because it wasn't given or inherited. It was earned. I stood behind the massive oak doors, my heart hammering against my ribs, not with fear, but with profound, surging anticipation. This was no longer just a wedding. It was a declaration. When the moment came, the chapel doors swung open. There was no gentle swelling melody from the pipe organ. Instead, the air was split by a sound far more sacred to my ears. A single, powerful, unified roar from 500 throats, a sound that shook the very foundations of the old chapel. A sound of absolute respect. General on deck. Instantly, as one, the entire congregation rose. It wasn't a shuffling, polite gesture. It was a single fluid movement, a forest of bodies snapping to the position of attention. 500 hands raised in a crisp, simultaneous salute, held in a silence so absolute, so heavy with reverence it was deafening. It was the sound of loyalty. The sound of family. I began my walk down the aisle. My path was a narrow channel carved through this sea of honor. These were the men and women I'd led, the faces I had seen in the deserts and the mountains. Their eyes, as I passed, held no idle curiosity. They held allegiance. They held respect. They held a fierce, protective love. I kept my gaze fixed forward on the calm, smiling face of James, my partner, my equal, my safe harbor. I did not spare a single glance for my blood family. In that moment, surrounded by my true family, they had ceased to matter. Our vows were as unique as our partnership. We didn't promise riches or obedience. We promised to be each other's forward operating base in times of conflict, and each other's secure rear echelon in times of peace. We swore an oath to be partners in every campaign life would throw at us. When the chaplain pronounced us husband and wife, the applause was thunderous. As we turned to walk out, a new honor awaited. An arch of sabres had been formed, but it wasn't a traditional 6-person detail. Dozens of officers stood in 2 long lines, their polished sabres raised to form a glittering tunnel of steel that stretched from the chapel doors far out into the bright Surrey sun. Walking through that archway of honor, hand in hand with James, the sounds of celebration ringing in my ears, my eyes scanned the crowd. I caught a glimpse of Isabel. She was standing near the back, no longer in the family pew, but on the periphery. An outsider looking in. She wasn't clapping. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her face a pale, frozen mask of defeat. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. Then, like a ghost fading in daylight, she turned and simply vanished into the dispersing crowd. She had lost. She hadn't been defeated by a single word of mine. She had been defeated by the truth of my life, a life she could never diminish and a family she could never touch. Our wedding reception wasn't held in a fancy hotel ballroom with crystal chandeliers. It was held in a cavernous aircraft hangar on the base, the only place large enough to contain my real family. There were no elegant round tables with floral centerpieces. Instead, long, simple folding tables were lined up in rows, and coolers filled with ice and beer were stationed every few yards. The air was loud, not with a string quartet, but with booming laughter, with war stories being retold, with the vibrant, chaotic energy of people who had lived life at its most extreme. Marines came up to me and James all evening, but not for formal congratulations. They came to share a piece of their lives with me. Sergeant Major Harrison grasped my hand in both of his grip firm. "Thank you for being at my wife's funeral last year, ma'am," he said, his voice thick. "You flew halfway around the world. I'll never forget that." A young female pilot, no older than 25, told me that my story was the reason she had found the courage to join the Royal Marines Aviation Program. This wasn't a wedding reception. It was a living testament to my true legacy. One built not on grand titles, but on 1,000 small, unseen acts of leadership and loyalty, Later that night, long after the last beer had been drunk and the hangar had fallen silent, James and I were in our hotel suite. The adrenaline of the day had faded. In its place, I felt a strange, hollow emptiness. The lifelong war with Isabel was finally over, and its conclusion had left a profound silence in my soul, like the ringing in your ears after a loud explosion ceases. It was the quiet of an empty battlefield. James saw it immediately. He came and sat beside me on the edge of the bed, taking my hand in his, not saying anything. "I feel empty," I admitted, the words barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze full of understanding. "Every war has an aftermath, Charlotte," he said softly. "You've been conditioned to fight for so long. Now you have to learn how to live in the peace you've won." His words were simple, but they cut to the heart of it. I had won. But victory had also come with a loss. The loss of a sister, even a toxic one. The final definitive death of a hope I hadn't even realized I was still clinging to. A quiet, aching sadness settled over me. Not for the woman Isabel was, but for the little girl inside me who had once, a long time ago, desperately wanted a real sister. My parents had slipped away right after the ceremony, without so much as a goodbye. Their departure was less of a surprise, and more of a quiet confirmation of what I already knew. The next morning, I sat alone by the window, watching the calm, grey waters of the Thames flow steadily toward the sea. I took out my phone and opened my contacts list. I scrolled to their names. Father and mother. I had kept their numbers for years. Through every deployment, through every silent holiday, holding on to a microscopic sliver of hope that one day they might call just to say they were proud. But that day would never come. Their actions at my wedding were the final proof. I took a deep breath, a long, slow exhale that felt like I was releasing decades of pent-up waiting. Then I performed a small symbolic ritual of liberation. I deleted their numbers. There was no anger, no hatred, just a quiet, serene acceptance. It was time to stop waiting for something that would never arrive. It was time to write the final chapters of my story, untethered from their approval. Just as I pressed delete on my mother's contact, an email notification pinged on my screen. My heart clenched. The subject line was a single jarring word, Isabel. I braced myself for another attack, another volley of vitriol. My thumb hovered over the delete button, but a morbid curiosity made me open it. The email was not what I expected. There was no sarcasm, no manipulation. It was short, cold, and shockingly honest. Yesterday, Father told me I embarrassed him. For the first time in my life, I saw that he was wrong. They didn't stand up for the stars on your shoulders, Charlotte. They stood up because you stood up for them. We don't salute blood. We salute truth. That was it. It wasn't an apology. It was a concession. It was a truce declared on the battlefield of our lifelong war. It wasn't an act of love, but it was, in its own strange way, an act of respect. For the first time, Isabel had seen me, not through the distorted lens of her own jealousy, but for what I actually was. She had seen the truth, and that, in the quiet of my hotel room with the Thames flowing endlessly outside, was the closure I never knew I needed. Years passed. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq faded from the headlines, replaced by new conflicts and new challenges. I now stood in my office in Whitehall, a place that had once been my personal battlefield of bureaucracy. From my window, I had a clear view of the Thames and the city beyond it. The office was no longer a place of struggle. It was my command center. Project Aegis was no longer a fledgling side project funded by my savings. It had become a fully institutionalized multi-million-pound program, a mandatory policy across all branches of the British Armed Forces. It had saved thousands of lives, not with bullets, but with counseling, with compassion, with the simple revolutionary act of seeing a warrior's invisible wounds and treating them with honor. I no longer had to fight for a seat at the table in these conference rooms. Now, I was the one who chaired the meetings, implementing the kind of ethical, empathetic leadership reforms I had spent my entire career fighting for. The work was still immense. The battles were still there, but they were now battles of my own choosing. I looked out at the city, and for the first time, I felt a deep, unshakable peace. A peace not given to me, but built by my own hands. One spring afternoon, I was invited to be the guest speaker at the Royal Naval Academy in Dartmouth, Devon. Standing before thousands of bright-eyed officer cadets, the future leaders of the Navy and Marine Corps, I didn't speak of tactics or strategy. I didn't recount tales of battle. I spoke about the true cost of leadership, about the profound sacred responsibility a commander has for the mental and spiritual well-being of their troops. I spoke about Lance Corporal Mitchell. I told them that the bravest thing a leader can do is not to charge into fire, but to create a space where their people feel safe enough to admit they are hurting. When I finished, the entire hall rose to their feet in a wave of applause that felt like a validation of my life's work. As my eyes scanned the vast audience, they landed on a familiar face in the guest section. It was Isabel. She was no longer the smug, perfectly polished media star. She looked older, her face softer, stripped of its usual armor of irony. She too was standing, and she was clapping. Our eyes met across the crowded hall for a long moment. No words were exchanged, none were needed. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something more honest. It was respect. A respect that had been paid for with a lifetime of pain and persistence. After the speech, as I was shaking hands, a young, sharp-looking Royal Marines captain approached me. She had a firm handshake and a pair of eyes that shone with unwavering determination. "General Floyd," she said, her voice clear and steady, "my name is Captain Eva Harrison. My father is Sergeant Major Harrison." My heart seemed to stop for a beat. I remembered Harrison vividly, his desperate eyes in the smoke of that firefight. "He told me the story of the day you saved his life more times than I can count," she continued, a small smile playing on her lips. "He said you were the definition of what a leader should be. When I was born, my mother gave me the middle name Charlotte after you." She squared her shoulders, a gesture so familiar it made me ache. "You, ma'am, are the reason I am standing here today." I looked at this brilliant, capable young officer, a woman ready to lead her own Marines, and I finally saw my legacy in its truest form. It wasn't the stars on my shoulders or the policies I had passed. It wasn't a name on a building or a footnote in a history book. It was standing right here in front of me, alive, breathing, and full of promise. The final circle closed a year later, at a ceremony honoring my retirement after more than 3 decades of service. As the formal event wound down, a man I hadn't spoken to in years approached me through the crowd. He was older now, his back slightly stooped, the formidable presence I remembered softened by age. It was my father. "Charlotte," he said, his voice thick and trembling slightly. I was wrong." He looked down at his hands, then back up at me, his eyes filled with a lifetime of unspoken regret. I was so blind, so focused on the superficial things, on appearances, that I couldn't see the diamond right in front of me. He took a shaky breath. "I am so proud of you." He reached out and pulled me into an awkward, unpracticed, but profoundly sincere hug. It was the hug I'd been waiting for since I was a little girl. In that moment, the last of the ice in my own heart finally melted. The cycle of hurt was over. That night, sitting quietly beside James, I found myself thinking back to Isabel's email from all those years ago. I remembered the final stark line. "We don't salute blood, we salute truth." I smiled, a real, peaceful smile. She had been right. My life had been a long, brutal, and beautiful campaign to prove that very point. And I realized then that the sweetest revenge, the most profound victory, wasn't about winning at all. It was about truth. It was about forgiveness. And it was about the quiet, unshakable strength you find in standing tall in your own honor, showing others that they can do the same. My journey taught me one profound lesson. You are the sole author of your own honor. The voices from your past or your present that try to diminish you can be loud. But the truth of who you are, forged in your own fires, is always louder. This story is my truth, but I know I'm not alone in fighting these battles. So many of us have had to build our own chosen families and define our own success against the odds. If you believe in the power of stories that give strength to the resilient, I invite you to become part of our community here at Hidden Family Infidelity and Revenge. Please like this story if it touched you and subscribe, so you never miss another chapter in our shared journey. Thank you for listening.